Alright, Game Over, one of my favorite films of all time, and, in my opinion, the very best Indian genre film ever. If you've spent any time watching my channel, you know this. Game Over has everything I want when I watch a horror movie, but the main ingredient here is that this film makes you feel. The vast majority of modern horror films are so overly concerned with being cool that they're kind of damning themselves to be lame. This didn't start with Scream, but that film really dried the cement around the idea that horror needed to be hip and modern and jaded. Game Over is a middle finger to all that. It's a real movie, not some hardened, cynical millennial meme that just happens to run an hour and a half long. I'm looking at you, Conjuring Universe. Or really just about anything that Blumhouse has squeezed out of their infected orifices over the last decade or so. If you haven't watched it, please stop this video right now and head over to Netflix. It's there with English subtitles. Watch the movie and come back to me. I mean it. It's too good of a first experience to be wasted on my deconstruction. If you're not a Netflix subscriber, you can rent it on YouTube, Apple TV, Google Play, or Sling. So no excuses. And for clarity, this video is about the brilliant 2019 psychological slasher film directed by Ashwin Saravanan, not the lame-ass 2003 TV movie starring Yasmin Bleeth, or the 1989 holiday home invasion meets Home Alone movie Deadly Games, which is sometimes also called Game Over. That one's an okay watch, so maybe add it to that list of movies you mean to see but will probably never get around to. Also, you'll probably notice there's 3 versions of Game Over out there. As my channel's audience is mostly made up of native English speakers, this may not make much difference because you'll be relying on subtitles in any case, but I suggest watching either the Tamil or the Telugu version. Since the film was shot in these languages, the Hindi version is a dub. Lead actress Autopsy is fluent in 5 languages: Hindi, English, Punjabi, Tamil, Telugu. That's 4 more than me. The movie opens with a motorcycle delivering food to Amutha, a young woman with close cropped hair. This is being recorded via camcorder from a distance. This found footage opening is unnervingly superior to almost all example of that subgenre. It just feels uncomfortably real. The editing feels unedited, if that makes sense, as if these aren't cuts made for dramatic purposes, but rather simply whenever the killer has decided to press record or stop, with the resulting jump cuts excluding key context but adding authenticity. Wait, I almost forgot something. Or rather, this is something I only noticed while preparing this video, but is really, really cool. In that opening sequence, we watch through the viewfinder of the killer's camcorder as the delivery person drops off dinner. But once he starts moving towards the house, we get 2 quick jump cuts and the house appears closer and closer after each splice. These handheld shots are as jerky and unsteady as any you'd find in a Jason Bourne film. But the handheld camera work is cleverly hiding a pretty huge secret which will only be fully revealed in the film's final act. If you watch closely, you'll see that each of the 3 shots is not only closer to the house but from a slightly different angle. In other words, we're not seeing jump cuts from a single camera, but rather the footage from 3 cameras being spliced together. The film is quite literally revealing the twist that there are 3 killers in the most subtle way possible. It's almost imperceptible on first watch, but undeniable once you notice it. Like virtually every scene of Game Over, it's only with multiple watches that the true brilliance of the movie emerges. We've seen murder sequences from this first-person perspective as far back as Peeping Tom, but there's something more to this stalking sequence, it feels. Unstaged. The killer watches through a window as she watches television and eats the meal she had delivered. Then he's inside the house, obsessing over the photos on the walls. We see artwork which reads, "I didn't fight alone." He's in her bedroom, then watching her shower. But this isn't a Hitchcockian homage as much as it's meant to contrast Psycho's high-stylized, iconic sequence. Uncomfortably, this just feels like a pervert filming an oblivious young woman showering. Then she's asleep in her bed. He's watching her from within the room. And you know what? It feels like we are him. We don't belong here. Why are we doing this? It doesn't feel good. She rolls over and accidentally triggers a response from her phone. Screens will play a very important part of this story, so it's no coincidence that Amuta's phone accidentally awakens her. She sees the killer and attempts to flee, closing her bathroom door. Hard cut to Amutha in her living room, hands bound with a plastic bag duct taped over her head. She's suffocating. We watch her struggle for what feels like forever, even if it's only a minute or so. This feels like legit snuff, which isn't quite as easy a filmmaking task as you might think. Genuine crime footage has a certain matter-of-fact quality that's often absent in movies that try to imitate it. It's like those shots of news report broadcasts in movies, they almost always just look off. But not here. Then we're in a soccer field, we hear the killer drag her, then stop and we hear the unmistakable sounds of her being brutally stabbed to death. Cut to her headless body on a chair. Cut to her headless body set on fire. Cut to the killer kicking her decapitated head through the goalpost. Whoa, that's a lot for an opening scene, isn't it? Kind of makes the opening kills of Friday the 13th or Scream look unambitious, doesn't it? But locked inside this vicious opening is a lot of hidden plot details. I'll tease them out as we go along, but let's start with this. As illustrated by the killer playing soccer with Amutha's head, the film has already smuggled in the idea that the crimes we're about to watch are a game. Not in a John Kramer in a pig mask sort of way, much more literally, and at the same time figuratively as well. You see, here's the thing, the title Game Over isn't a random choice. This film is undoubtedly the best video game adaptation ever, even if it's unofficial, and unlikely. Thing is, Game Over is Pac-Man. Or, more likely, Mrs. Pac-Man. I know, that sounds absolutely insane. What's actually crazy is that it all fucking works. It shouldn't. I wouldn't have greenlit this movie, but it does, and I would have been 100% wrong. I should finally point out, before we really begin looking at the film, that I'm not a gamer at all. I had a Magnavox Odyssey 2 as a kid and have enjoyed the occasional arcade game, but I've never played anything through to completion, not even close. And still, this movie resonates with me on a very deep level. So if you're not into video games, no problem, I'm with you. Even in that opening kill, we got the image of a head rolling across a playing field, didn't we? How is that not a direct analog to Pac-Man? Even the image of the decapitated body seeming to burst into flames recalls so many video game deaths. The opening credits are a buzz of video distortion, lightning-quick found footage clips, and more than a few clues about the story we're about to watch. This starts with the title screen. We see a game controller that looks like a skull inside a red circle. Then 3 hearts appear, one by one, like a crown over the death's head. I asked you to watch the movie before continuing with this video, so you should know what that's foretelling. Among the grainy stalking footage and flashes of newspaper headlines, we see a victim exiting a tattoo parlor. That's an incredibly important detail. Also notice that although the film makes no attempt to hide where it's set, these newspapers are in English. Now, India was a British colony and English is widely spoken throughout the country, but this intentional choice goes beyond the newspapers in the film. Just as Amita's wall art read, "I didn't fight alone" in English, you'll see that our heroine's walls are also covered in important notes that are also in English. The simplest reason for this is that Indian films end up dubbed and subtitled in many languages because of the historical and tribal territories that make up the nation. English is a common language and even carries a weird neutrality. Also, the video games that the movie references all have English as their default language. We open with a location title shot. In this case, since I'm using the Tamil version as reference, this is the city of Chennai. Our protagonist Swapna lives in a gated community on Old Malappuram Road, a very famous location in southern India. For native Indian viewers, this would immediately bring to mind the large population of IT workers who live in the area. Certainly middle class, but metropolitan and very western. This is very much like setting Halloween in Illinois in that it instantly sets up a safe suburban community without having to do much heavy lifting. But even this establishing shot has some visual relevance. From our vantage point, we see the houses and streets along Old Malappuram Road as a grid, much like a classic video game's maze. We are introduced to our lead character Swapna in the only way a film adaptation of Pac-Man should. She's out on a morning run. Notice how the white posts of the wire fence she runs alongside evoke the food pellets that Pac-Man must eat to complete each level. And what do we make of Swapna herself? She's in incredible shape. She pushes herself. She's disciplined. At the same time, she's obviously no action hero. Even just exercising, she exudes a level of vulnerability. Considering where her journey will lead her, this is the best possible way for us to meet her. She's at her physical strongest here, but we'll soon see that she's fundamentally broken. By the end, those two attributes will be juxtaposed. She'll be physically broken, but will overcome her trauma. Swapna ends her run at her housing complex's security checkpoint. It's not much more than a shack. Maybe it reminds you of the pen in the center of the Pac-Man maze where the ghosts populate? The mason pathways outside Swapna's home get plenty of attention from the camera. Can you think of another film that bothers to have shots like this? I bet you can't. But what do they remind you of? Again, to the unsuspecting first-time viewer, it passes right by you. But once you realize that the film is using video games as the landmarks of a visual language, it's easy to relate the brick paths to Pac-Man's maze. Inside her home, Swapna is on a conference call with a client's company. It's here that we learn that she's a video game designer. The dialogue isn't some cheap expository shortcut either. The conversation only contains the language you'd expect to hear between two parties in a business deal. At no point does anything get said for the sole benefit of the viewer. No, we're getting a realistic glimpse of Swapna's day-to-day life. That we also start to build up a sense of who she is, a benefit of this naturalistic approach. We've all seen those cop shows where one police officer turns to another and explains a part of their job that the other cop should clearly know, but the audience wouldn't. That's bad writing, I'm sure we can all agree. There's nothing remotely like that here. Swapna's assistant, Kalama, has made her lunch. Their friendly squabble of the amount of salt in the food relays a lot about their relationship. They respect each other and their roles in each other's lives. Kalama cares deeply about Swapna's health. We don't quite know that there's a really good reason for her to do so, but the groundwork is laid right here up front. We can also glean that while they're close, they're not romantically involved. The warmth they project for each other is sisterly. Not that lesbianism is a common theme in Indian cinema, but here especially it would be out of place. Swapna has been hurt by intimacy. She'll only let people get so close to her. Kalama answers the door to find that a repairman has come to look at the backup power generator. We see that there's a video doorbell system, something like Ring, an assistant door camera, backup generator. It all seems to point towards someone who's put herself in a cocoon of safety and security, doesn't it? It never feels overdone, though. We don't get a shot of a door with a dozen deadbolts on it. There's no attempt to batter the viewer with exaggerated imagery to make sure they get the point. We get a series of quick cuts from around Swapna's office, and they're all important to the story that's about to unfold. A framed sign reads, "Do not disturb gamer at work." Seems pretty self-explanatory, right? Here's the thing, smuggling in the word disturb insinuates the idea that Swapna is not mentally well. The second message, also from a framed poster, reads, "What if life is a video game and deja vu are just checkpoints?" Ignoring the grammar, this is essential. Swapna's life isn't a video game, but her mind will shortly use a video game to help her make sense of the trauma that has derailed her life. Referencing deja vu and checkpoints foretells the 3 chances she'll have to overcome her past in the third act. Finally, a pop-up on her computer screen says, "Welcome to Unreal Engine 4." Sure, as a game designer, she'd use 3D modeling software to build an environment for games to be played inside. And Unreal Engine by Epic Games is probably the best known platform, so it makes sense to use it in story. But why would we even see this pop-up? How does it possibly inform the surface narrative? Of course, at a certain point in this movie, we'll no longer be seeing the real world, but rather a simulation that Swapna's psyche is using to deal with her issues. Her mind at that point is operating much like a computer modeling program. Also, the name of the program helps to nudge us into understanding that what we're seeing is not meant to be literally real. From the signs on the walls, all of which are pretty on the nose on a second watch but only vaguely meaningful the first time through, we see Swapna sketching 3 characters for the video game she's developing. They're cartoon mid-evil knights. Or are they? Nope. Here we see Swapna's earliest conceptualization of the 3 villains. That is, the 3 ghosts from Pac-Man, if you will. I mean, after all, she is confronting the memories that haunt her. These 3 figures hold weapons, roughly coinciding with those that the killers wield at the end of the film. This little cut, which lasts about 2 seconds, is so vital. Swapna has been sheltered herself away from society, refusing to meet with clients as the anniversary of her assault looms. She uses the game she's developing as a tool to overcome the insurmountable anxiety she feels. And here's the first moment where she's encapsulating the source of her fear into 3 characters. You might protest that the earlier killings don't support this. Well, the film isn't just talking about Swapna's abuse at the hand of a rapist on New Year's. It's clear from the outset that the film is a criticism of a society, in this case India, which struggles to address the widespread abuse of women. There's more evidence of this later, but for now, understand that Swapna is an avatar for all women who have suffered in silence in a society that sometimes turns a blind eye. Also, I should point out that video games make for a really strong foundation to do this kind of substitutional narrative. Anyone who has played or even watched someone play a multiplayer role-playing game online understands just how much those games put the best and worst of people on display. The unbridled and hatred-filled slurs used as an intimidation devices in gaming communities dovetails nicely with the stalk and slash genre all too well. Kalama sneaks into Swapna's bedroom to clean, which sparks a low-key argument. Kalama wants to clean the house as a New Year's tradition, but Swapna says she'll do it herself, that her assistant won't know where to put her things. Here they are not really talking about dusting and mopping. Kalama wants to help Swapna put her life back in order so she can start the new year without her trauma hanging over her. But Swapna understands that only she can do so, but she's also lying when she says she'll do it. She's not ready to confront the pain from her assault, and at that moment, the tattoo on her left arm sends out a burst of pain. It's her body calling out bullshit. The tattoo itself is a single 16-bit heart surrounding a video game controller. The design is very meaningful. To save herself, as represented by her heart, she'll need to take control of her life back from the memory of being victimized. The whole plot is really right there in the tattoo. I should mention that I have this tattoo on my left arm as well. I love this movie, but I also love what the tattoo represents. After a brief discussion about the pain, we cut to Pac-Man's main screen. Well, sort of. Almost no one notices at first, but there are only 3, not 4, ghosts in Swapna's version of the game. The yellow ghost. Clyde is missing. This obviously is a portent of the 3 killers that will come for her later in the film. But wait, why would the filmmakers choose to change the number of villains from 4 to 3? It's a very intentional choice. And I believe it's because there's another cultural reference simultaneously at play here. Swapna's not the first fictional character to be visited by 3 ghosts in December. Charles Dickens did it first in A Christmas Carol, probably the best-known Christmas ghost story of them all. The ghosts there represent past, present, and future, and I believe the slashers here do the same. She must come to peace with the horrors of last New Year's Eve today in order to survive until tomorrow. The shift from Christmas to New Year's makes sense considering that less than 3% of Indians identify as Christian. But New Year's, well, it's still New Year's because India follows the Gregorian calendar just like most of the world. Swapna sleeps off the pain. When she wakes up, she immediately fires up her game console and attempts to beat her Pac-Man high score. She keeps a tally of her high scores in a notepad, and you'll notice that she seems unable to get past a score of 144,200. She has multiple entries that show that for some reason she cannot progress beyond that point in the game. And that's how her personal recovery from trauma is going too. In some ways, she's been able to pick up the pieces of her life and resume her job. But that only goes so far, and she comes up against a point where the healing cannot continue. This is because she has not yet confronted what happened to her and defeated it. That the movie takes the time to show us her playing the video game, along with the fact that the film has intentionally tweaked the game, is definitive proof of this narrative thread. And right in the next scene we get an illustration of that hard limit to Swapna's recovery. After showering, she discovers that the light to her walk-in closet has blown. She's unable to enter into the dark. We get a quick insert of her in black and white on the floor, bound and crying. As Kalama goes in to change the bulb, we hear the sound of a chorus partygoers counting down the seconds until New Year's. Overcome, Swapna shuts down and slides down the wall, unable to even stand. A dark closet is too high a level in this game of recovering from trauma. Swapna makes an emergency appointment with her psychiatrist. He listens to her describe the panic attack and quickly surmises that she's suffering from a condition known as anniversary reaction. Now that sounds like made-up movie bullshit, doesn't it? It's not. The Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health's website has an article on the phenomenon. In fiction writing, it's always a challenge whenever you choose to write about very specific issues that only those inside a specialized field would be aware of. The average reader or viewer tends to turn their nose up at the idea of actually having to learn about a subject in order to be able to follow a story. Thankfully, the good doctor here gets it all out of the way very succinctly. Is it exposition? Sure, but because Swapna and Kalama don't know about the condition any more than we do, it's not the bad kind of exposition. It would still be shitty writing if we needed to understand the medical situation in great detail, but it's wisely only used to explain the countdown clock that the film has just introduced. You know movie countdown clocks, right? Like when Ripley sets a ship's self-destruct in Alien, and we as an audience discover that time has been weaponized. Here Swapna has only a few days before New Year's to defeat her mental demons. The doctor asks how she's been sleeping. Swapna reports that she sleeps fine, but Kalama steps in to offer that she plays video games all night. So, rather than dream where she might have a nightmare about her assault, she's trying to beat Pac-Man. Up until this moment in her conversation with the psychiatrist, she seems engaged and outgoing, but as soon as this subject comes up, she retracts and becomes guarded and withdrawn, because she doesn't want to face her real fears. Beating a game seems safer. Of course, Given that she can't seem to get past a score of 144,200 or so, it's obvious that the two are intertwined. The doctor tells Swapna that her anxiety will pass after the holiday and that she should just take a break from work and go visit her parents. Mind you, this sounds like horrible medical advice on the most obvious levels, but you should keep in mind that we don't know exactly how much Swapna has revealed about her past to him. He clearly knows something happened on New Year's Eve last year, but it's unclear if he's fully aware of the assault. So here he's treating the symptom, that is, the anniversary reaction, not the cause. And maybe that's all he can do if she hasn't explicitly shared. India, like many Asian, Middle Eastern, and Latin American cultures, is more family-centric than most Western societies have become. Reconnecting with family is often seen as a cure in times of trouble, and he's on to something, at least as far as Swapna's story is concerned. Swapna's little house is very much an extension of her separation from her family. We'll hear it later when she remembers her parents blaming her for facilitating her own assault. She's grown distant from them both physically and emotionally. Now, this might be really easy to miss if you, like me, have only ever experienced American society. We tend to move out of our parents' home earlier than anywhere else, but for most of the world, and especially the East, this is not the norm. He tells her she shouldn't be alone. We cut from here back to those brick walkways that surround Swapna's home. Unlike earlier, she's now walking with Kalama. Most films would cut this short scene out entirely. The rule is that if you've already established a setting, you don't need to show people come and go from it. It's usually considered dead screen time that should be eliminated. If you've ever watched any really cheap amateur movies from untrained filmmakers, you'll recognize that they always include too many of these scenes of characters coming and going from locations we already know. Here, though, this little walking scene helps because it showcases the two women together, which we've just been told is essential to Swapna's safety. And, of course, they're walking on the film's reference to the Pac-Man maze. Swapna's not in trouble when she's with Kalama. Just a brief word about actress Vinautini Vaidyanathan, who plays Kalama. While this movie is undoubtedly Taapsee's show, Vaidyanathan is pretty stellar in a less showy role. Most films ask their leads to ground the movie, but here she's the one who represents a sense of normalcy. If her performance had been bad, this whole movie falls apart. Thankfully, she's got her arms fully around it. While there are men in this film, it's specifically a movie about women and trauma, and a weak performance anywhere could derail the whole damn thing. Dark, however, that this short scene ends with a pan over to the metal swing outside Swapna's front door. Later, this will be the stage on which a particularly horrific moment occurs, and has direct correlation to the issue of Kalama representing safety for Swapna. As soon as she's inside, Swapna returns to playing Pac-Man, and Kalama busies herself with chores, doing laundry and picking up fresh diesel fuel for the generator from the complex's security guard. With a door between them, she tells Swapna that her father wants to visit her tomorrow, but Swapna rejects that idea, stating that she has an appointment with her skin doctor already scheduled. Swapna falls asleep playing the video game. Did you notice that she was again unable to beat her high score? In fact, she lost the game at exactly the same place, 144,280 points. Her attempts at self-therapy is in a doom loop, and the reason why she cannot beat the game, and at the same time overcome her trauma? Well, the answer to that is on screen as well. You can see that there was no player 2 as evidenced by the 0 score there. Game over is about learning to trust people again. Until she does, she's bound to lose. Trust begins in any relationship with sharing how you are feeling. It's difficult to do, I damn sure know that. I tend to bottle everything up, even from those I care most about. I sometimes think my depressive mood swings are infectious and I don't want it to drag anyone else down with me. That may or may not be Swapna's issue as well, but maybe one of the reasons I connect so much with this film is that self-isolation is something I definitely grapple with. Shit, is this a slasher movie, Autopsy, or self-diagnosis? Anyway, moving on. Having fallen asleep on the couch with the lights on as she typically does, Swapna dreams of the day she got her tattoo. If you've ever gotten ink, you'll recognize the ritual that the film shows. Filmed in black and white, the sequence is the first since the credits in which the film's musical score features a clean melody. And while it's not literally primitive mid-E, Ron Ethan Johann's masterful composition manages to conjure up a cocktail of old-school video games, synth-driven 1980s horror films, and off-kilter pop music. That the film uses the music very deliberately makes it more powerful. As we watch the tattoo being applied, Swapna sees a woman hang a photo on the studio's wall. We recognize her as Amitha, the victim we saw murdered in the film's opening. In the photo, she's smiling and displaying her own fresh tattoo, 3 hearts on her left arm. This is obviously relevant, but if you're watching closely, you'll notice the man wearing a baseball cap wandering around behind Swapna. We will see him again very shortly, and critically, that scene will be in color. Swapna is startled out of her sleep and accidentally knocks over the lamp by her couch. The room plunges into darkness, and Swapna freaks the fuck out. She panics and leaps to her feet, runs across the room, and falls directly into a body-length mirror, cracking it and cutting her arm. This has nothing to do with a textual reading of the movie, but goddamn if that's not the most realistic laceration I've ever seen in a movie. I have no idea whether it is a practical effect or digital, but the shot of her holding it under the faucet, totally convincing. This new trauma, of course, prompts a pain response from the tattoo. The concept of spilled blood unleashing an uncanny response is a familiar horror trope. Think about the scene in Hellraiser where Larry Cotton accidentally spills his blood over the spot where his brother died. This, of course, relates back to all ancient religions' use of sacrifice as a way to please the gods. Somewhere in the back of our lizard brains, we still see the offering of blood as a bridge between our world and a proposed afterlife. Notice I used the word uncanny and not supernatural. Thing is, Game Over is not free from supernatural ideas. There's the clear insinuation that Amutha is helping Swapna from beyond the grave. But it's never explicitly shown to be the case, and thank God for that. A CGI ghost Amutha popping in would undoubtedly ruin this film. As it stands, we connect the dots to whatever degree we as viewers are comfortable. And that means the movie works differently for every viewer. That's a wonderful thing. Swapna revisits the tattoo parlor where she had her work done. The establishing shot is a pan across the room, starting at a station in the corner. We see the baseball cap wearing tattoo artist again, and now that the scene is in color, we see that his hat is bright yellow. He's working on a client. 2 other artists hang out around him. One of the guys is dressed in blue jeans and a blue flannel. The other reaches down and plucks a bright red binder off a low shelf. Yellow hat, blue clothes, red binder. Yes, these correspond to the color of 3 of the ghosts from Pac-Man. So, super attentive viewer, you've now met our villains. The movie isn't going to give you some throwaway unmasking sequence and villain speech. This isn't a Scream sequel, because none of that matters. This is Swapna's movie, not theirs. This isn't a Jason or Michael flick where the killer is the star attraction. It's kind of surprising that tattoos aren't often the subject of horror movies. The idea of subjecting yourself to hundreds of tiny punctures, of having an artificial substance injected into your skin, is as strange as it is badass. We know for certain that a form of tattooing was practiced as far back as 5,000 years ago, which means that people were inking up 3,000 years before Christ. Hell, the English language is only 1,400 years old, meaning that body art could truly be considered one of the earliest forms of communication that is still being practiced today. Swapna speaks with the artist who inked her tattoo about the pain she's been experiencing. At first, the artist just explains that there's no way that any kind of infection would be to blame a year later. But then she tells her a troubling story. Amutha's mother came in the same day to get a memorial tattoo of her late daughter. Amutha's ashes were mixed with the ink, but there was a mix-up and the ink intended for Amutha's mother was used on Swapna instead. I should probably mention that the name of the shop is Immortal Inks. I'm not going to elaborate on that, I'll just leave it as is. You got this. Back in her house, Kalama and Swapna argue over this new information. Swapna thinks the tattoo is the cause of her troubles. Kalama wants her to just see a skin doctor and that the tattoo can't be the cause of the pain. The conversation quickly shifts from the tattoo to the New Year's Eve assault. Kalama says that her attacker is in prison and she needs to move past the ordeal. Swapna explains that she cannot, that she's become terrified of the dark, that she hasn't slept well in months, and then says,
When I close my eyes, I feel surrounded by ghosts.
Ghosts have not played a role in the story up until this point. There have been no levitating objects, demonic voices, or shadowy figures at the foot of her bed. But, because she equates overcoming her trauma with beating Pac-Man, the language here is appropriate. She's not breaking the fourth wall. The conversation between these 2 women is not just a performance for the audience. No, this is more like a Freudian slip. She's revealing her mind. Breaking down, Swapna explains that while the whole world celebrates New Year's Eve, she must, in her own words, stay home and fight her fears. This isn't quite as poetic as it probably sounds. She's absolutely correct that this is what's coming. As the anniversary of her assault gets closer, she senses that her ability to shut herself off from anything that might trigger a traumatic response is vanishing. She's right. We cut to an overhead shot of Swapna sitting in her walk-in closet. A poster rests on a shelf that reads, "Video games ruined my life." Good thing I have 2 more. It's as if she's absorbing all of the prompts from the decorations around her house and using them to build a narrative framework that will produce a scenario where she can confront her fears. Probably worth noting, too, that classic video games often put up short messages between levels. The film uses set dressing to serve a similar purpose. Intercut with black and white shots of her assault, we watch as Swapna contemplates slicing her wrist with a knife. No coincidence that this occurs right after she has an argument with Kalama. The assault scene is presented very differently than you might expect. In American cinema, we've grown accustomed to graphic rape sequences and everything from the Oscar-winning The Accused to down and dirty revenge flicks like I Spit on Your Grave. But this scene is much more in line with Jacques Tourneur's Cat People. It's more interested in evoking the emotional carnage of such a crime than the physical act. And maybe that has more to do with the conservative conventions of Indian cinema than a conscious choice by the filmmakers, but that doesn't matter. The effect of the scene is profound specifically because it does hold back. After all, Swapna refuses to come to grips with what happened, so why should her recollection of the event be explicit? In any other movie, the heroine would decide not to kill herself. Not here. There's every indication that she means to go through with it. But the tattoo has other plans. Another burst of pain, this one more intense than the previous ones we've seen, sends her to the floor in a fetal position. Her brain may have given up, but her heart, as signified by her heart-shaped tattoo, refuses to let her surrender. But her head isn't done fighting to protect her from facing her fears either. She calls a skincare clinic and schedules an appointment to have her tattoo removed. Basically, if her heart won't let her weasel out of confronting her trauma, she'll have it removed. This is brutal stuff. Slasher films are almost exclusively drawn from the man versus man narrative and conflict model. But not this one. This is head versus heart. In other words, man versus self. That's enough of an evolution to make Game Over one of the most important stalk and slash films since the subgenre's conception. The battle between head and heart continues at the clinic. Just as the technician is about to fire up the laser, Swapna is hit with a crippling burst of pain. The tattoo is not going down without a fight. And after a second attempt, Swapna is forced to surrender. That tattoo will stay. I don't want to minimize the horrors of the Second World War, not ever, and especially not in a discussion of a slasher movie. But there's an interesting parallel that I do want to touch on here. Concentration camp survivors always had the option to have the prisoner numbers tattooed on their arms removed. There were chemical and surgical options before laser removal, but very, very few have. Why is that? Based only on interviews conducted over the years, a few common responses have arisen. Although the tattoos are a reminder of the inhumanity of the Nazis, they serve a much deeper psychological need for some of the survivors. The numbers they wear are not their identities as a person, but they are a symbol of their shared triumph over evil, so they identify a collective of people with a shared experience that the world should never forget. Removing the tattoo risks obscuring the horror concentration camp survivors endured. Whew, that went dark, didn't it? I promise I'll try to stick to silly slasher movie commentary. But the point still stands. Swapna's heart isn't allowing her to remove the tattoo because to do so would be to paint over her trauma rather than deal with it, as well as ignore Amitha's tragic death. Although at this point Swapna hasn't heard that name or known that she was the victim of the murderers at large. Did I just promise things were going to get lighter from here? Okay, that was a total lie, because the next scene is probably the most heart-rending moment in the film. In the days after the failed tattoo removal, Swapna hits up a local coffee shop. While she waits for her drink, two young men at a nearby table recognize her from a pornographic video they've both seen on the internet. Turns out that her New Year's Eve assault was filmed and uploaded to a video sharing site. It's clear from her stunned expression that she wasn't aware of this. The young men laugh and joke about the video, not realizing that the attack was real and not staged. And as tough as this moment is, it's also the point where Autopsy's acting simply crushes every other final girl performance in film history. Vulnerable, shell-shocked, and angry, she rushes out of the coffee shop and walks home in a stupor. The montage that follows is a grim collection of images of her breaking down. It's heartbreaking. It's horrible. And it feels disarmingly real. Now, wait a moment. Perhaps because of their argument, Swapna went to the clinic alone, not with Kalama, as she normally would. Her human safety net removed, she's especially vulnerable. But because she pushed her only friend away, she's left alone to suffer this newest painful indignity. I can imagine that if Kalama had been with her at the coffee shop, the two might have been lost in conversation with one another, and she would never have noticed the young men at all. We hear the conversation between her parents that Swapna must have overheard after her assault. Her mother blames her for getting a tattoo, which she believes sends the wrong message about a woman. Her father doesn't think the tattoo was as much the issue as going out unchaperoned on New Year's Eve. And we hear her own self-doubt, blaming herself for not trusting her intuition when she felt something was wrong and not fleeing. She repeats the words she said to her father, "I can't change anything, Dad," just like that high score she can't overcome. This leads to her second suicide attempt, this time by hanging herself in her walk-in closet. This closet sure does own parts of her psyche, doesn't it? Again, I won't spell it out because I think it's pretty obvious, but sometimes setting is as important to thematics as anything else. Again, it appears that Swapna is committed to finishing the job, but when the electricity fails and the overhead light goes out, she panics and helps Kalama into the room. Kalama wraps herself around her in a bear hug, or that human safety blanket as I just referred to her. Kalama knows what almost happened. In a hospital waiting room, Kalama tells Swapna that her mother called and that her parents are coming over that night. She swears twice that she didn't tell them anything about the suicide attempt, but then she says that Swapna's mother made a reference to seeing something online that was prompting their visit. Swapna excuses herself, walks out into the hall, up several flights of stairs, and throws herself off a third-floor balcony. A car interrupts her just before her impact on the asphalt, saving her life. This third suicide attempt is important because, after all, old-school video games always gave you 3 lives, right? I will stop here to say that, although I think that this is as close to perfect as a film gets, Game Over has one shot that is, well, flawed. And it's this one. While the transition from real actress to computer-generated character is seamless, and the 3D model itself is fine, the motion doesn't quite look right. It's too much like a janky video game. Oh wait, right, never mind. Swapna survives, but is left in a wheelchair and with lesser injuries to her neck and arm. Now confined to a chair, the physical correlation between Swapna and Pac-Man becomes more obvious. Notice the figurine of Pac-Man in her room as she's first helped into the wheelchair by Kalama. Okay, I want to backstep to earlier in the movie right now. I intentionally skipped over a section of her visit to her psychiatrist for a reason. The scene is really important, but only really begins to affect the main narrative at this point, so I decided to discuss it here instead of when it occurs in the film's chronology. The doctor uses a pair of VR glasses as a therapy tool to help Swapna confront her fear of the dark in a safe and controlled environment. She's free to take the goggles off if it gets too intense. The video she watches is simple. She walks from room to room, with each threshold she passes putting her in a darker and darker environment. When it gets too uncomfortable, she begins to hear the New Year's Eve countdown chant. At that point, she pulls off the glasses. She's not ready to confront those demons yet. This scene accords exactly to the remainder of the film. We have one more major scene to go before Swapna will put herself into her own game of Pac-Man, but it's here at rock bottom that it really begins. That remaining scene will fuel her will to survive, but at this point she's out of time. New Year's Eve is here. She has no choice but to confront her past. She puts herself in a video game to contextualize her assault. But this time, she doesn't need VR glasses. So, here's something slasher films don't do. Game Over tears your heart out. The scene begins with Swapna covering her tattoo with a large square adhesive bandage. Figuratively, she's hiding her heart and her feelings. Before Swapna's game begins, she's visited by Amutha's mother, played to heartbreaking perfection by Mala Parvati. She hands Swapna a jump drive containing a video message from Amutha, asking her mother to join her for a tattoo session. We learn why the 3 hearts tattooed on Amutha's arm are so important. She was the victim of an aggressive form of cancer that she'd beat 3 times. 3 times, Jesus, but she'd beat it each time. After each remission, she got another tattoo. After her murder, her mother finally decided to get the tattoo she'd always planned on getting with her daughter but had never found the time for. And she had intended to have her daughter's ashes mixed with the ink. That ink, of course, was accidentally used on Swapna. Tell me that's not heavy emotional stuff for this sort of film. I double dog dare you to watch it and not feel like bawling your eyes out. Damn if it's not an incredibly powerful moment when Swapna peels back the band-aid to show Amutha's mom her own heart tattoo. It's a bizarre reunion of sorts between mother and child, one that feels completely original from a story perspective. But you know what? Screw that. You can't analyze a moment like this. It's pure emotion. And it's pure cinema alchemy. A moment that couldn't be produced in any other medium but film. It's at this point that even if you hadn't been in love with Game Over, you fall for it. It's impossible not to recognize that you're watching something very special. And yeah, how often can you say that about a fucking slasher movie? To add insult to injury, the movie then has Amutha's mom hand Swapna a greeting card that she'd sent to her daughter when Amutha first found out she had cancer. You just know that it's going to be read aloud and that you're going to keep fighting off those unmanly tears, right? The card reads,
We all have two lives. The second one starts when we realize we only have one. Fight like a girl. Love. Mom.
two lives? Like the real one where Swapna struggles to recover from sexual assault on New Year's Eve, and the internal one where she must fight to survive against 3 assailants? It's freaking perfect. I love the fight like a girl thing too. It's a bit more playful, but it's very much an empowering message that all final girls should receive. Funny, I don't remember Ginny Blake getting a Hallmark card. Swapna calls and cancels the second appointment for tattoo removal. She tells Kalama to call her parents and tell them that she's coming home. She surrenders the folding knife that she almost used to slice her wrist to Kalama, and she smiles for the first time in the film. Mutha's mother's visit has changed her from fearful to hopeful. She's reaching out to the people she cares about with trust and love. No coincidence that she starts another game of Pac-Man. Everything's going swell, right? Well, no. Because we cut to a handheld shot of Swapna that's framed identically to one of the first voyeur shots of Amutha that we saw at the beginning of the film. One of the killers holds up a black and white photo of Swapna from the day she got her tattoo. It's marked as number 10. If you saw the film in theaters, this is where the intermission card came up. Yes, Indian films still have intermissions. They're glorious. But usually there's just a single title that comes up and says interval. And then when the film continues after the 5-minute break, it just, continues. Game Over was a little different. The out title read pause and the in title read game on. I find that so fucking cool. Swapna has fallen asleep on the couch. Kalama turns off the couch side lamp, which would have been a serious issue before Mutha's mother's visit. But Swapna seems at peace. Outside the handheld camera's point of view stalks the housing complex. It studies the doors and windows as well as spying on the security guard in his booth. We notice that milk has been delivered to the house late. It's 11 at night on New Year's Eve. Swapna awakes to the sound of glass breaking outside the house. She sends Kalama to investigate. Kalama checks the security system but only sees a shadow, which she assumes to be the security guard. But then she notices the milk canister waiting to be brought inside. She hesitates but then goes to retrieve it, and she's rushed by an unseen assailant. This is feeling a whole lot more like a typical slasher movie, isn't it? When Kalama doesn't return, Swapna gets into her wheelchair and goes to investigate. Her wheelchair moves through the rooms. Now that she's in the chair, the furniture and doorways all have a familiar blocky maze design. If you haven't guessed, Swapna didn't wake up. Everything from the intermission onward is taking place entirely in her head. This is her internal healing process playing out as a secondary narrative. I mentioned that she didn't need VR goggles this time, right? Swapna finds the milk canister spilled on the floor with the front door open. She closes the door and then follows the sound of beeping to the refrigerator. The door's open. I wish my refrigerator had that feature. She's clearly freaked out and suspects that someone is in the house. Then she goes to the large double windows in the living room. Her view is partially obstructed by a palm tree, but she can see Kalama on the metal swing. She calls out to her but gets no response. She moves to the next window. She can see Kalama better now. It takes a second to realize that her head is missing. But then Kalama's decapitated head slams up against the window. As with Amutha's murder, one of the killers is a soccer fan. Swapna gasps and propels her wheelchair through the house. The Pac-Man races on. And maybe that's what the refrigerator beeps were. The starting bell. Horror movies often put their victims into positions where we can empathize with their plight. The psycho shower scene is a particular example. Can you imagine being more exposed than naked and cornered in her Oksini shower stall? Or tied up to the carnal diner table in Texas Chainsaw? Or waking up with a metal contraption that will split your head in two as in Saw? We've already established that Swapna is at her most vulnerable without Kalama. And now, with her best friend dead and her legs broken, she's all but helpless. Swapna does her best, though, rolling to the table where her phone is charging and calling 112. India's equivalent to 911. The lights go out. This time it doesn't seem as coincidental as a rolling blackout. No, someone cut the power. She's in the dark and now there's no way out. She must confront her fears. I love that we hear a breaker trip as the lights vanish and the musical score kicks in at top volume. It's a droning, heavy pulse accentuated by the sound of a ticking clock. Even the music is counting down until New Year's. It's so dark and disturbing that it puts all of the whispery, shrieky soundtracks from the Conjuring films immediately to shame. I'm sure you don't remember the score to those movies. Go ahead, pause this video and go listen to them on Spotify or YouTube or wherever. You'll see what I mean. Her panic rising, Swapna rolls quickly towards the living room, no doubt heading towards the front door. But at the threshold, the wheelchair overturns and she is sent spiraling onto the floor. She crawls forward, but then notices something strange on her left arm. Instead of the single heart, there are now 3 tattoos. She's perplexed, but then remembers that Amutha had 3 heart tattoos on her arm to signify each time she beat cancer. A man-shaped shadow falls across Swapna from the doorway she just came through. It's the first of the killers, or ghosts. He looms over her with a machete in one hand and a camcorder in the other. That the killers record their victims reflects that her sexual assault was recorded and released for public consumption as well. All of her fears are manifested in this leather-clad, masked figure. He steps forward, easily catching up to her, and puts a boot down on the cast on her foot. He releases her long enough to perform the same move on her hand. He's toying with her. He's in complete control, just like the rapist who told her Happy New Year's after he was finished abusing her. The ghost grabs her by the hair and lines the blade up with her throat. And we watch from her point of view as he cuts her fucking head off in 2 swipes. What? The final girl dies? And not even after an extended fight? This whole movie has been leading up to this brief encounter? All of our investment in this great character and she dies so quickly? What the fuck? Well, no. We're still in Swapna's point of view. Grimly, the view from eyes within a decapitated head as one of the 3 heart-shaped tattoos on her arm disappears. The killer drags her body off and sets her on fire. Whenever Pac-Man dies in the game, he folds in on himself and disappears in a tiny implosion. Incineration is probably the closest realistic movie representation of that. In the theater where I saw Game Over initially, this scene caused a lot of reaction. First there was shocked disbelief, and then once the tattoo disappeared, gleeful applause when the audience realized what the film had done. Sure enough, to confirm this, Swapna then wakes up, now with 2 tattoo hearts on her arm. She's lost the first of her 3 video game lives. She has 2 more chances to overcome her fears and take back her life. Now, 2 years before Game Over, the American slasher film Happy Death Day gave its heroine multiple lives to avoid a grisly fate in a similar fashion. And really, there's plenty of precedent before that, ranging from an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge to Carnival of Souls to the Final Destination films, but it's never been with so much internal logic or with such masterful execution. Comparisons to those earlier works just don't make much sense when the others amount to little more than an elevator pitch like, what if Groundhog Day was a slasher film? On her second play, Swapna seems to be as aware as the viewer what is happening. She waits for the glass to break outside and immediately screams to Kalama not to go. Kalama does go out, but Swapna throws a bottle against the wall and she quickly comes back inside to check on her. How many times has Swapna played Pac-Man only to remain stuck at her high score? Is the problem that she keeps playing the game the same way each time? If so, she's already in better shape this time through. She calls the police and gives them a very clear-headed snapshot of the situation, including a description of the killer. Kalama questions her about how she could possibly know what the man looked like. A couple quick points here. The dreaded cell phone problem is dealt with very elegantly here. Swapna uses a landline and reaches the police without issue. Thing is, the police can't solve this problem anyway, so the writer didn't have to create some contrivance to wave away the access to a phone. But how great is it that all of these characters are doing exactly what they should do to survive? In the first playthrough, there was no reason for Kalama to suspect she was in danger. Going out for the milk canister isn't just reasonable, it's part of her job, and here on the second run through, Swapna calls out for help immediately and gives not just her address but a description of the car in her driveway. She's doing all right, as is Kalama by questioning how Swapna could describe the killer. We've become so accustomed to characters in horror movies doing outright stupid things in order to provoke tense situations. From opening frame to closing credits, Game Over opts for a much more confident style of storytelling. One in which the audience is treated with respect and the characters aren't depreciated for cheap dramatic purposes. As before, the lights go out. Kalama reacts almost as strongly as Swapna. There's a little bit of maternal empathy between these 2 women. We never get to see Swapna's parents for the same reason we never see Laurie Strode's. Parental figures should represent safety. Take a bunch of young people out of their parents' watchful glare and put them in summer camp cabins and you've lit the fuse on primal fears we all experienced as children. Kalama has a mother-like responsibility to Swapna for the first 2 acts. In the third, their roles partially reverse, and it's Swapna who assumes the protective role. Part of Swapna's character arc is going from a victim who can't get out of her own head and trust people again, to a guardian. Of course, since we're in her head, the real Kalama is safe. You could read the third act as being concrete reality that just happens to reflect her fixation with Pac-Man, but that's a step too far for me. And besides, we see her wake up a few too many times to ignore the idea that she's really asleep through this entire ordeal. Molotov cocktails burst through the windows and explode on the floor. The two women have no choice but to move. Staying put isn't an option unless they want to burn to death. Swapna's psyche is upping an ante and not letting her off easy. They rush into the living room only to find one of the ghosts sitting in a recliner, legs crossed, with a camcorder recording away. It's one of the film's most startling images. Seeing the killer's comfort with what he's doing, detailed by his obviously relaxed body language, is absolutely chilling. To me, this ghost's laid-back demeanor is far more frightening than Jason Voorhees' heaving chest and angry huffs. There's a pregnant pause as Swapna comes face to face with her fears. This killer in leather represents all of her anxiety that has built up for an entire year. He's sitting in her living room, recording her, no longer just a lingering shadow of her assault, but now a present threat. Then something happens that once again never happens in a horror movie. The police knock on the door. Kalama wheels Swapna as quickly as she can towards the front door. The killer leaps to action, swiping his blade across Kalama's back. Swapna nearly reaches the alarm system, but the ghost catches her wheelchair and pulls her back. That same sense of cat and mouse as in her first play. He never speaks a word, but the sneer in his performance comes through crystal clear. The killer wheels her up to the keypad, then pulls her back again. It's a game to him, because, well, it's a game. The title of the movie almost gives it away. The killer overturns the wheelchair. Swapna falls to the floor. The killer approaches, adjusting the blade's hilt in his hands. Swapna reaches out for the window curtain and pulls it back. The police officer sees her and the killer, and without a second's hesitation draws his sidearm and shoots the killer in the face. Killing off the first ghost was almost as unexpected to the theater audience as Swapna's first death. We're so unaccustomed to the police being actually competent that this moment has genuine shock value. Both cops enter the house. One keeps his weapon trained on the fallen ghost, the other checks on Kalama. She's dead. Swapna's safety blanket is gone again. Outside, Swapna sees the shadow of a man in one of the windows. He closes the curtain. She informs one of the police officers. He heads inside only to find that in true slasher film fashion, the killer's body is missing. But then, against the normal grain, the cop commands his partner to get Swapna in the police car and drive away. Damn, when are the police ever this good in these movies? The music comes back hard, and that ticking clock sound is now faster and more urgent. This is a movie that knows how to get your blood pumping. As they pull away, Swapna sees the dead body of the ghost roll into the street in her wheelchair. Then, two other ghosts arrive. One drops the lead cop's severed head onto the roadway. One of the ghosts raises the dead killer's gloved hand and waves goodbye to Swapna. Then she notices that there's a burning rag hanging from the gas tank. She yells for the cop behind the wheel to stop, and he obeys. But it's too late. The vehicle explodes in a fireball. So ends play number 2. Pac-Man may have eaten one of the ghosts, but ultimately the other two won the round. Swapna again wakes up at 11 p.m. She has only a single heart-shaped tattoo left on her arm. Her last life? Maybe. But this time she wakes with a different perspective. Instead of rushing to turn on the light, she stops herself. Earlier, the trauma of her assault was epitomized by a fear of the dark. That she's choosing to stay in the dark and face her fear as a break from her routine. Given the choice of fight or flight, she has always chosen to flee. But not this time. Even in the gloom, she can still read the greeting card from Amutha's mother. She needs to realize that she only really has one life in order to be able to have a second chance at life. In other words, she needs to eat her ghosts. The ghost boys assemble outside, looking very much like both the 3 Pac-Man ghosts on her monitor screen and the 3 medieval knights she drew earlier. The music doesn't wait for any dramatic reveal this time. It's full game on time now. Ron Ethan Johan's driving score goes into overdrive. This is it. Last life. The lead ghost walks to the front door and raises his camcorder up to the security system's camera. 2 cameras recording each other. This is very much the same effect as having 2 mirrors facing each other. The resulting image is a seemingly infinite vortex. I say seemingly because not only is each reflected nested image smaller than the last, but it's also dimmer. The act of reflecting and recording absorbs light. The killers take their positions, but Swapna is already ahead of them, describing a situation that has not yet taken form to the police. She even goes further, giving the dispatcher a shortcut to reach the house even faster. To Kalama, she explains that while the police may or may not reach them in time, it doesn't matter. They both might die, but they should go down fighting. This is coming from the girl who has tried to kill herself 3 times in the last 2 weeks. Fuck yeah, Swapna. You are the best final girl ever. Your character arc simply decimates all those other bitches. You'll notice that Amutha's theme. A little 3-note triad that sounds like a flute. plays as soon as Swapna and Kalama's plan to resist takes root. This time it's Swapna that pulls the main breaker and kills the power to the house. She's taking control back by weaponizing her fears against her fears. As one of the ghosts climbs to the second floor to enter through a bay window, Kalama climbs to the third floor balcony and pours diesel fuel from the generator on him. And then Swapna tosses a lit candle out of a window. The ghost bursts into flames. A proper revenge. They're fighting like girls, all right. The police arrive, handguns drawn. Don't quite throw that victory party just yet, though. The lead ghost wastes no time killing both of the cops. And the third ghost tosses Kalama down the house's spiral staircase. Responding to her friend's scream of pain, Swapna rolls into the living room and is immediately cornered by the third ghost, who brandishes a scythe and loops it around her neck. But while Kalama may have fallen, she's not done. She impales the killer's foot with Swapna's folding knife. As he struggles to remove the blade, Swapna disconnects one of the wheelchair's metal footrests and bludgeons him over the head with it. He overturns her wheelchair, and she finds herself once again on the floor. But Swapna continues her assault, bashing his head in with the footrest. 2 ghosts down, 1 to go. That's the past and the present. Now she fights for her future. The lead ghost descends the spiral staircase. Swapna and Kalama crawl into her bedroom, but Kalama is dragged away. The killer continues to pursue Swapna, now with his camcorder recording her. She catches sight of her broken full-length mirror and punches it off the wall. It collapses on top of her. She grabs a long and slender sliver of glass, but the ghost anticipates her attack and instead stomps on the wooden frame, then kicks it away and pins her hand to the floor with his boot. But he hasn't incapacitated her left hand, the one on the same side as her tattooed arm. She snatches up another shard of mirror and plunges it into his neck. He staggers back, then falls unconscious to bleed out on the floor. It makes sense that the weapon she used to kill her anxieties and fears is a mirror, because the whole third act has been a reflection of her, anyway. And only by reconnecting with herself and no longer locking herself away from the world to work on video games can she survive. Kalama is badly injured, but we see that she's alive. That rekindled friendship represents the reason Swapna was able to find the strength to survive. New Year's can now be about starting fresh on that second life, because she realizes that she only has one. And that sharing that one life with friends and family is really the best medicine for the pitfalls of this world. Thank you for joining me for this storytelling autopsy. These things take a lot of time and energy, so I appreciate you watching. This one in particular took much longer than I anticipated, and that's because I believe that Game Over is the most consequential slasher film since the subgenre's creation. It belongs in every discussion of movies about masked killers. Taapsee Swapna is the best written and most well-rounded final girl in movie history, and her performance is far more nuanced than any that came before her. My hope is that a film like this can raise the bar for all that come after it. Maybe it'll take some expensive triple slipcovered 4-disc limited edition 4K release for that to happen. Or maybe you can just spread the word, because horror movies should be a shared experience, not something we do alone. That's the whole point.